The new Higher Education Standards Framework 2015 will apply from 1 January 2017. TEQSA has a project to support providers and other stakeholders with the transition to these new standards. This presentation reflects key points from a series of provider briefings undertaken around Australia in April and May 2016. The presentation will be delivered by Dr. Michael Tomlinson, who is leading the transition project.
Agenda. This presentation will cover the general approach to implementing the new Higher Education Standards Framework, key features of the Higher Education Standards Framework, evidence requirements for renewal of registration, some of the key support materials we'll be making available on our website, frequently asked questions, and how to obtain further information. Approach to implementing the Higher Education Standards Framework 2015. The new Higher Education Standards Framework will come into force on 1st of January 2017, following extensive consultation with the sector. As we've heard, all providers must be compliant with the standards framework from the 1st of January 2017. What this means in terms of regulatory applications is that all applications made before 1st of January 2017 will be assessed against the Higher Education Standards Framework 2011. All applications made on or after 1st of January 2017 will be assessed against the new Higher Education Standards Framework 2015. So TEQSA is preparing for this transition over the course of the remainder of 2016. Approach to implementing the Higher Education Standards Framework 2015 continued. The approach that we're taking to implementation of the new standard can be characterised in a number of ways. Firstly, keep it simple. We're not engaging in minute analysis of different formulations as they differ between old and new standards, but keeping to the broad differences. We're prioritising development of the most critical materials which will go up on the website first, such as application guides, bearing in mind that there's a considerable lead time that providers need to develop their applications. We're adopting a beta release strategy, so the materials will go up in beta format first, allowing us to make minor corrections and clarifications in the weeks that follow. We're taking the opportunity to introduce a few further streamlining measures to streamline our processes, and where particular standards are relevant to current hot issues within the sector, we are pointing this out in our guidance material. There are two advisory groups that are overseeing the work that we are doing. Firstly, the Higher Education Standards Panel, which advises the Minister, has a general advisory role, oversight role. But we have also convened a special standards transition reference group, contained of representatives of different stakeholder groups, and they're advising us particularly on the impact of particular aspects of the transition on the providers, and they're providing input on the general approach, the materials, the issues that we're highlighting, and engagement with providers in general. Key features of the Standards Framework 2015. This is a diagram that was developed by the Higher Education Standards Panel and Executive to represent the conceptual framework and the structure of the standards. The standards consist of 7 domains. Within the domains are sections, and within the sections are standard statements. The outermost ring of the dartboard shows the way in which the provider represents itself to the outside world, the information that's made available to stakeholders such as prospective students, and we see them on the left of this arrow that goes through the whole dartboard. Prospective students are trying to find out whether the courses at the institution are the types of courses that they want to undertake. The next domain in is governance and accountability. Governance and accountability is classed as an overarching domain. The governance boards of the provider direct and authorise everything that happens within the provider, within the organisation. They are heavily reliant on the institutional quality assurance domain, which produces reports and information about the quality of the learning environment, which is at the centre of the entire system. And the learning environment clearly is shaped by the teaching and the research training going on within the organisation. So prospective students enter from the left, and if they decide to enrol in the organisation, they then proceed through the other circles and exit, we hope, from the right with certified qualifications. Key features of the Higher Education Standards Framework 2015 overall. Out of the total number of standards, the standards panel calculated that approximately 50% of them constituted rewritten or reformulated versions of topics within the 2011 standards. About 25% of them had been imported from the National Code of Practice for Overseas Students, particularly the educational aspects of the National Code. There's a goal here to focus and concentrate educational quality requirements within the Higher Education Standards Framework, leaving the National Code to focus more on some of the immigration and visa requirements. And about 25% of the standards in the new framework relate to topics that are entirely new in learning and teaching, research and information management. And the standards have been structured to align with that student life cycle as much as possible that we saw in the previous diagram. Key features of the Higher Education Standards Framework 2015 overall. The Standards Panel wanted to ground the new framework in the core characteristics of provider operations. In other words, they looked out into the sector and they asked themselves what would be the essential characteristics of a truly functional higher education provider, and they used these as the basis for their framework. We observed that many of the standards are based on principles, outcomes, not structures or ways and means of achieving the outcomes. For example, the section on academic governance does not say anything along the lines of there shall be an academic board. It talks about the principle of academic governance, but it doesn't prescribe any particular structure or way of achieving that principle. The section on corporate governance focuses on the roles and responsibilities of the governing body. And the panel also wanted to facilitate the use of the provider's normal operational materials as evidence to submit with an application to TEQSA, so that normal operational reports on, for example, student performance could be used, the ones that normally are generated through the annual cycle, rather than ones specially fabricated for an application to TEQSA. Student participation and attainment issues. So as you might expect, given the focus on the student life cycle, section 1.1 starts with admissions. So the first principles here are that all criteria for admissions and conditions of enrolment for entry into a particular course or for courses in general need to be stated up front so that students can clearly understand what they are and their eligibility. There is a link here through to policies and procedures for granting credit, monitoring student progress, and volume of learning in the course. So the focus here is, are students positioned for success? If they enter with qualifications and experience of a particular level, if they're granted credit, if they're granted advanced standing, are they positioned well in order to be able to complete the course successfully in the time available to them? The hot issue in relation to admissions, of course, at the moment, is the use of minimum ATAR scores and related policies and procedures. So if a minimum ATAR score is quoted, is it going to be clear to the student what that means? Can I get in if I have an ATAR score lower than that minimum that's quoted, and if so, on what basis? So this links through very strongly with Domain 7 which is about the transparent provision of information. And there's also a link to the National Code of Practice for overseas students. Student participation and attainment issues continue. Section 1.5 deals with qualifications and certification. The principle is put forward here for the first time that qualifications are only awarded for completing a course at the right level. And this links through to later sections on course design that we'll consider in a moment. The hot issue here is security of certification. There's a whole industry out there, as you know, dedicated to helping students claim to have completed courses that they haven't in fact completed. Now, this is to some extent beyond the control of providers, but there is an obligation on providers to design their certification in ways that make it more difficult to fabricate. There is also an important section on learning outcomes, which we will mainly consider when we come to the section on course design, which is about requirements to specify and assess learning outcomes of courses. Learning environment issues. Facilities and infrastructure are dealt with in a way that's fairly familiar from the 2011 standards. The essential principles is that they must be fit for purpose. Fit for purpose in the sense that they support achievement of the learning outcomes of a particular course and in general, and they need to be accessible. In renewal of registration, we don't normally focus on facilities and infrastructure in general. In a renewal of accreditation of a course, we might focus on specialist facilities that go beyond the normal classroom setup. For example, if a college were entering into aquaculture for the first time and offering a course in aquaculture, not agriculture, aquaculture, we would want to know what type of aquaculture facilities were going to be made available to the students so that they could get practical experience in running a fish farm. A new requirement here is that facilities and infrastructure must support academic student interaction outside formal study. When we first looked at this standard, we weren't sure whether it meant academic interaction or social interaction, and we've definitely defined it to mean academic interaction. In other words, it is really about giving students the space for engaging in group work, unsupervised group work. For an online course, these spaces would have to be online spaces, whereas in a face-to-face course, they will be the normal physical classrooms and similar facilities and syndicate rooms. There is a new section on diversity and equity. What would we expect here? Well, clearly there should be a policies and procedures framework in place relating to diversity and equity. Now, in the Standards Transition Reference Group discussion of this section, some providers were concerned to point out that the missions and locations of providers varies. I think what they were thinking about was that outcomes will vary according to mission and location. So student numbers from particular equity groups will vary from provider to provider. We think this is a reasonable point. We're not expecting numbers of enrolments from different equity groups to be identical across the country, but the policy framework has to be in place, and if people apply who come from particular equity groups, the courses and the provider must be accessible to them, and any particular support that is required needs to be available and provided. Learning environment issues continue. There is a section on student grievances. In the slide that has an asterisk because we've come for the first time to some core standards for the renewal of registration. The reason why they're core standards is that obviously student grievances will always occur in any provider, but if there is a particular pattern to those grievances, if those grievances tend to recur around particular topics, that may indicate that there are problems in that area that need to be investigated. So again, we would expect that a policy framework must be in place, but further, it should be applied fairly and consistently. And it should be applicable not only for current students, but also for prospective students, relating, for example, to their admissions. and it needs to be operated within a responsive environment. We have had the experience of going to one large provider and being told by students within a particular field of education, the managers and the staff don't like us lodging complaints. This is not what we want to see. And there needs to be an avenue of appeal to a specified independent third party, not just a general acknowledgement that you can make a final appeal outside the organisation, but there is a specific dispute resolution service or ombudsman that is nominated that you can go to if you fail to get resolution of a complaint within the provider. Teaching issues. And here we come to three related sections dealing with course design, learning outcomes, as we mentioned before, and assessment. These are core standards for course accreditation, clearly, but not for renewal of registration. So the expectations here are that when a course makes its way through the approval processes towards being authorised, there should be a course proposal, and the course proposal should detail the structure of the course, the individual components of the course, such as subjects or units, and their content, and what resources are being allocated to delivery of the course. Now, the whole of the course proposal elements must be consistent with the AQF level. Now, this is a slight change from the 2011 standards, which specify that the course must be consistent with the AQF qualification type. The AQF level specifications are somewhat broader, and they don't include the volume of learning guidelines. So this means there is some added element of flexibility which we will need to apply to course proposals that we assess. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we will ignore volume of learning entirely. And we're very conscious of the fact that a number of the recent controversies in the vet sector have centred on RTOs delivering qualifications with very short durations or volumes of learning. For example, a diploma being delivered in a matter of weeks, where clearly it would be impossible for students to achieve learning outcomes, the course learning outcomes within that time. So, while acknowledging that providers will be able to make out a case to us for a volume of learning that's smaller than the benchmarks, nonetheless we have to put a floor under this. So the AQF guidelines will be a benchmark, but there could be other benchmarks relating to, for example, common practice in other respected countries and institutions of learning overseas. So we have available on the website at the moment a series of FAQs relating to the AQF issues in the context of the 2011 standards, so we will be renewing that. We will be producing a new edition of that in the near future. So the course proposal, getting back to the proposal, needs to demonstrate firstly that course learning outcomes are fully specified, both at the course level and the unit level, but also there should be an alignment of the level specifications in the AQF, the course learning outcomes, the unit learning outcomes, and the assessment. And this alignment needs to be demonstrated not only through a map, such as a table, but there also needs to be an underlying rationale. For example, if we return to our aquaculture example, you would expect that some of the course learning outcomes in an aquaculture course would deal with fundamental science. Some of the course learning outcomes would deal with the practical aspects of running a fish farm. So some of the assessment tasks would therefore have to relate to the science, and some of the assessment tasks would have to relate to the practical application and would therefore be quite different in nature. So this needs to be explained to the approving body, whether it is the academic board or whether it is TEQSA, in a rationale. Teaching issues continue. There is a section on staffing, including casual staff, which is fairly continuous with the staffing requirements in the current 2011 standards. It is largely course focused, so it is focused on requiring that staff teaching the course have the qualifications and experience necessary. and there's a return of our familiar AQF +1 principle. So the staff need to have qualifications that are one AQF level higher than the course that they're teaching. But again, there is a possible exemption for staff who have high levels of professional equivalence. Now, this doesn't mean that ad hoc decisions can be taken about staff who don't fit the AQF +1 requirement. There needs to be a framework. Decisions that a particular staff member has professional equivalence at the level required have to take place within this framework. It has to be codified. So how many years of additional professional experience at what level are equivalent has to be specified. Now, there is an implied requirement, again, for academic leadership to be in place. And this is a very important area for us. Over the last 4 years, we have found that academic leadership is one of the key discriminators between providers that make it and providers that don't make it. Providers that have strong academic leadership in place in each discipline that they teach tend to do well. Providers that don't have strong academic leadership in place in each of those areas, we often find recurring problems, recurring risks of not meeting the standards, or that the providers simply don't meet the standards. So the academic leaders need to be able to guide and direct the staff to create that learning environment. They need to be able to develop staff scholarship, make decisions about professional equivalence, and provide professional development opportunities supported by the provider. There is a section, as you would expect, on information resources, 3.3. Fundamental principle is a familiar one. Information resources provided must be sufficient to support students to achieve the learning outcomes. So to come back again to our aquaculture example, if we haven't taught aquaculture before, we need to review the information resources available in the databases and find out whether the databases will contain aquaculture articles and references. And if not, do we need to add a new database? Research and research training areas. So here we come to two related sections within Domain 4. The first of these is about research in itself. And one of the most important things we need to consider here is that 4.1 applies to all research that's carried out within a provider. It's not just about research within a research training context. Any research carried out by a staff member or by a student is covered by these standards. Now, in our guidance material, we start by looking at what the definition of research should be to define the scope of this standard. What sorts of research does it apply to, and what sorts of research does it not apply to? And we've taken the definition of research that applies here from commonly available definitions used, for example, by the ARC, which concern making a contribution to knowledge. So research that might take place in a minor student project with a small r is not relevant here. It's really about research taking place that makes a contribution to knowledge. So we would expect to see here again a policy framework in place. We would expect to see that research is conducted by staff with qualifications and experience in conducting research as required by these standards. And there shall be a system for recording the outputs of that research, the publications and other outputs. So the requirements here are fairly basic, fundamental level requirements. Organisations that are accepting grants or awarded grants from AIC and other grant-giving bodies will probably be required to meet higher requirements. But these are the fundamental requirements for anyone engaged in research. Research and research training issues continued. Section 4.2 does deal with research training. Again, there needs to be a research training policy framework in place that defines the life cycle of the high degree by research student. But there's also a requirement that there higher degree by research training should take place within an environment of research activity in a particular unit or institute or department. And this is where there is a link back to 4.1 now. So a higher education provider that offers HDRs must make sure that they are only offered in areas where the staff are engaging in a sufficient level of research activity and collegial research activities. And resources must be made available to support research in each of those areas. There are specific requirements for supervisory arrangements. So there needs to be not only a principal supervisor, but also an associate supervisor. This is quite common in the sector, but hasn't actually been required before. Research students need to go through some form of induction to give them an introduction into the very different learning environment of research training. And there should be a framework of academic governance and quality assurance, which would be the normal framework that applies to all coursework within the institution. Institutional quality assurance issues, which are part of Domain 5. Section 5.1, these are starred because they are core standards for renewal of registration. Section 5.1 deals with the course approval and accreditation. There needs to be a policy framework. There need to be course approval and accreditation processes overseen by peak institutional academic governance processes. Now again, the structures that exercise this oversight are not prescribed. Conventionally, they would be an academic board, but they don't have to be. But the key principle is that anybody putting forward a proposal for a course, the proposal needs to be subjected to independent academic scrutiny. Now, what does that mean, independent? Fundamentally, it means scrutiny by people other than the proponents of the course. This isn't a specific requirement for members of academic boards or the equivalent to be external to the provider. That's not required. However, there are requirements for some form of external referencing. So the proposals that were coming through would contain all of those elements that we've referred to before to do with course design and also the allocation of resources. Resources must be available to support delivery of the course. Section 5.2 deals with academic and research integrity. Again, the policy and framework needs to be in place, but also providers need to take action to maintain academic and research integrity. Again, there's another whole industry out there which is designed to help students put forward pieces of work that they have not actually completed. There's an arms race in which these consultants continually develop new ways of circumventing the academic integrity procedures of the institution, and then the provider has to develop new countermeasures to try and maintain academic integrity. And we realise this is a dynamic process. We realise that breaches of academic integrity may occur, but we want to be assured that the provider has an effective framework to address these, to minimise them as far as possible when they occur, to address them effectively. Institutional quality assurance issues continued. Section 5.3 deals with monitoring, review and improvement, which, as we said before, is an essential support for the governing bodies to assure themselves that standards are being maintained. So there's an expectation that cycles of reviews are taking place. These reviews will be more or less elaborate depending on the scale of the provider, but we would certainly expect, for example, that cycles of reviews of courses would be taking place. These would be both major reviews at the end of the accreditation period and also what's referred to in the standards as interim monitoring. For example, at the end of the semester, the subject or unit coordinators would review how the subject went in that semester and whether any adjustments need to be made in the light of student feedback. At the end of the year, there might be an annual review of how the course went, and as we say, at the end of the accreditation period, a major review of all aspects of the course. There would normally be reviews of student performance statistics, either on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, reviewing student performance statistics at various levels, provider-wide, fields of study, AQF levels, and so forth. In the larger providers, we would expect to see cycles of reviews of academic organisational units. This isn't specifically prescribed in the new standards, but we have found that where these cycles of review of organisational units are not present, where they've fallen into disuse, this allows inconsistencies to develop in the way in which standards are implemented between different units. There need to be cycles of reviews of academic policies and procedures, particularly those pertaining to academic matters such as assessment. There are requirements throughout for external referencing of course design, but also benchmarking of student performance. And all of these reviews need to not only take place, but they have to be used for a particular purpose. They have to be used in order to improve the courses for further delivery in the next rounds. Section 5.4 deals with third-party delivery, and it sets out the fundamental principle that the registered provider is responsible for ensuring that delivery takes place in accordance with all of the applicable standards. Governance and accountability issues, which is part of Domain 6, which, as we've said, is one of the overarching functions. So Section 6.1 on corporate governance is a core standard for renewal of registration, and it provides that there has to be a diligent constituted governing body, which contains some independent members. So this is quite different from the 2011 standards, which require a majority of external members. So what does this mean? Well, we take it that an independent member doesn't have a material, personal, financial, business or other interest in the provider, such as recent employment, business relationship, or an equity stake in the provider, an ownership stake. But it's more than that, it's also about independence of mind, the ability to critically evaluate a proposal that comes before the board and ask questions to ascertain whether it stacks up or not. The Section 6.1 also sets forth a number of key governance roles. It also requires, and this is a new requirement, that the provider undertake periodic independent reviews of the governing body and also of the academic governance processes. And we'll come back to that later. The responsibilities of the members of the governing body are many and various, and they incorporate the need to ensure that the provider maintains financial viability. Formerly in the 2011 standards, these were an entirely separate section. Here they are just one of the many responsibilities of the governing body. So TEQSA will still continue to monitor financial viability and to assess financial viability. But particularly for an existing provider, we will focus on the extent to which the governing body is assuring itself that the provider remains viable and how effective that their oversight of that is. Governance and accountability issues continued. So Section 6.2 on corporate monitoring and accountability, this is really the function that takes the outputs of that institutional quality assurance system and directs them up to the corporate governing body and the academic governance body and provides the information for them to do their job. So there should be a flow of reports arising from those reviews that we considered before that enable those bodies to monitor and correct any variations in compliance with the standards or any variations in quality that might arise. Variations happen. What we're interested in is the capacity of the system, the capacity of the governing bodies to detect those and to take action to correct them. Section 6.3, also a core standard, deals with academic governance. It sets out the responsibilities of the members of the academic board or equivalent, but also establishes firmly and squarely this principle of the collective processes must exist for the oversight of teaching, learning and research quality. Representation information and information management. So now we come to that outer ring of the dartboard that we looked at before, which is about how the provider represents itself to the outside world and to stakeholders. So section 7.1, 7.2 deal with representations that are made to the stakeholders, and particularly to students. And the essential principle here is that any representations made have to be accurate and not misleading, including about, for example, employment and migration outcomes of courses. So if you're teaching an associate degree in engineering, you shouldn't be holding out to students the prospect that if you complete the associate degree, you'll be able to obtain full membership of the Institution of Engineers and apply for a job as a certified or chartered engineer. A lot of representations, of course, to students, prospective students, are made by agents. So there has to be a framework for this. The agents need to be bound by formal contracts and their performance needs to be monitored. There are sections relating to this in the new version of the revised National Code, which we hope will be coming forward for consultation later in the year. Representation information and information management issues continued. Section 7.3 on information management requires all providers to maintain a repository of fundamental information, including a whole heap of things, information about the governance of the provider, information about the courses, but also information about the financial standing of the providers. Now, this is something that needs to be defined, and we have included guidelines about what this means in our forthcoming guidance note on this subject. And we suggest that the intent of this section could be met by developing a statement of financial standing to make available on the website. And rather than including very, very detailed information about individual aspects of the financial accounts, this would be based on a series of assurances that normally accompany the annual accounts, such as the Director's Declaration. Because what the student is really interested, or prospective student is really interested in finding out about the provider before they sign up to do a course there is this provider a going concern? Is there a likelihood that it will still exist when I finish my course in 3 or 4 years' time? So the statement of financial standing would include, we envisage, the Director's Declaration, the provider is a going concern, the auditor's opinion and any qualifications the auditor might make on the accounts. The statement should also include details of tuition assurance available, and if the full financial statements are already publicly available because they're required to be available by another regulatory body, then there should be a hyperlink to these. The fundamental principle underlying all of this is transparency. And particularly, of course, there needs to be transparency about the hot issue of the moment, admissions. As we said before, if minimum ATAR scores are quoted, what do they mean? How do I get in if I have a score below the minimum score quoted? So now we've completed our review of the actual standards themselves and what the requirements are on providers. And now we're going to look at some of the evidence requirements that we are going to make for providers, particularly providers renewing their registration. So let's look first of all then at that review of the governing body, the periodic review of the governing body that's required. Now we regard this as, if you like, the core of the core for renewal of registration, because it really focuses on that overarching function, that ability to self-correct any variations in compliance with the standards and in quality. And there's a requirement that the reviewers who undertake the reviews must also be independent. In other words, they themselves should have no recent relationship with the provider and should be able to review the provider's operations in a detached, impartial way. So what is the scope of this review going to be? Well, ideally, it would really cover all of the responsibilities of the members of the governing bodies that are laid out in sections 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3. The members are tasked with ensuring themselves that all of these aspects of the provider's operations are proceeding well. So how are they going to demonstrate that these responsibilities are in fact being met. The review of the governing body continued. So how would our independent reviewer go about their task? So how do they work out whether the members of the governing body are fulfilling their responsibilities or not, about all of those matters that we've considered? Well, they should have a look at the reports that are coming out of that cycle of internal reviews and being directed up the line to management and to the members of the governing body about the performance of the operation. Reviews of strategic performance, reviews of financial performance, reviews of risk management, reviews of academic quality and student performance, and reviews of assessment outcomes and academic integrity and benchmarking reports. So these are going up to the members of the governing body. Our independent reviewer would take a look at those to consider whether they provide the members of the governing bodies with enough information to assure themselves that operations are going well. So what about that review of academic governance? How is that going to work? Well, firstly, how does the link between corporate governance and academic governance work? How do the members of the corporate governing body assure themselves that academic oversight is operating effectively? Then, the academic governance approval body itself, how do the members of that body assure themselves that they are exercising academic oversight effectively through the course of the year? For example, how are they fulfilling the terms of reference of that body? What's the evidence for that? That's something that the academic governance reviewer would have a look at. So those academic course approval processes, how effective are they? What's the evidence for that? When were they last reviewed? How does the academic board or equivalent know that the course approval processes exist, okay, but are they being complied with all the way along the approval track from the beginning of the development of a new proposal up to final approval? How do the members of that academic approval body know or verify that course designs are up to date, for example? There was one case a number of years ago where a university was actually sued by a graduate student, and the principal ground of the action was that the course was not up to date. The course materials were not up to date. It was a fast-moving field, and they all referred to references to too many years in the past. How do the members of that body know that courses are being delivered in accordance with the specifications? There's a whole set of documentation that we referred to before that specifies the learning outcomes and the delivery methods. How will the academic approval body know whether the courses are being delivered in accordance with those specifications? How will they know whether students are actually achieving the specified learning outcomes for each course or not? How will they review student performance throughout the organisation? These are all questions that are very relevant to a review of academic governance, and evidence has to be provided to the independent reviewer in relation to each of these questions. Now, what about the other forms of evidence that TEQSA might request a provider to provide with an application for renewal of registration? We've talked about the core of the core, which is the review of academic governance and corporate governance, but what else will TEQSA be looking for? Well, TEQSA will also directly seek examples of the kinds of documents that the independent reviewers will be reviewing to check against the outcomes of the review. So TEQSA will directly seek copies of minutes of governing bodies, of course committees, and of risk management committees. For self-accrediting providers, where we don't get to see on a normal basis each proposal for new courses or renewal of courses or accreditation of courses, for self-accrediting providers, we will ask them to submit some sample course proposals that have been put forward recently for accreditation to the academic approving body. And we'll look at getting a sample of course proposals over a range of fields and over a range of different levels. We'll also be interested in directly looking at some sample reports on student performance data. It could be the annual report to the board at the end of the year, or it could be quarterly reports or semester reports, whatever is most relevant. And We'll want to take a look at the latest reports that are available on progress against strategic plans, the effectiveness of the risk management system, the effectiveness of student grievances and complaints processes, the effectiveness of academic integrity processes, and the performance of agents. Now, what about a provider comes up for renewal of registration early in 2017, and they haven't heard about all of these guidelines until now? What happens if there's no recent or complete governance review report available that covers this whole scope that we've been talking about? Well, wherever a base hasn't been covered in a recent governance report, then we will have to work only from these other reviews and reports that we were talking about in the previous slides. And we will ask for the report of a governance review to be made available to us whenever it is available. And we will ask when that has been scheduled to take place. Now, if we can't get some of these reports directly, then we will have to drill down further to the primary evidence, such as the policy framework itself, for things like complaints, student grievances, academic integrity, and so forth. In the case of academic quality and academic standards, then we would have to look at minutes of other types of meetings, for example, boards of examiners, moderation meetings, and so forth, to ascertain whether those were proceeding, ensuring academic quality. But our preference is to work at the highest level. If there is a very credible review report of academic governance and corporate governance that covers all the bases, we may not move down towards the lower levels as much, certainly, as if there is no such report available, or it doesn't cover all of the bases, or it's not credible. We'll try to work at the highest level as much as we can. Now we're going to look at some of the support materials that we're making available on the TEQSA website. There is a whole group of guidance notes that we've developed over the years available on the website, which relates to the 2011 standards. Now, we're renewing almost all of those and revising them to relate to the 2015 standards, but we're also putting up some new materials. For example, there is a contextual overview already up on the site about the nature of the standards as a whole, covering some of those points that we covered earlier about the structure of the standards and the philosophy underlying the standards. And there's also an overview for each domain. Domain 1, there's an overview. Domain 2, there's an overview, going right through to 7. And at the bottom of each of those domain overviews, there are links then out to the specific guidance notes on particular topics, such as scholarship, such as professional equivalence of academic staff qualifications, and so forth. So there are general overviews and there are specific guidance notes. Some of them are the same, some of them are on new topics, such as academic integrity, research, and so forth, which were not covered under the previous standards. In addition, we have mounted up new application guides for the major categories of TEQSA applications. So there are 3 of them. There's one for new providers or people applying to be providers for the first time, covering both initial registration and initial course accreditation. And there are 2 application guides for existing providers. There's one on renewal of registration, and there's one on initial course accreditation for existing providers, and renewal of accreditation of courses. Now, these guides contain an overview of the process with a flowchart, as well as tables of evidence requirements. Now, in the case of the new providers, the new aspiring to be new providers, we will have to assess them, of course, against every standard. So there are over 100 standards in the new framework. So we've been through each of those standards and derived what is the item of evidence or items of evidence that would demonstrate to our satisfaction that somebody met that particular standard. So as you would imagine, the table of evidence for aspiring providers is extremely long and extremely detailed. For existing providers, of course, we adopt the Core Plus approach. So we're not going to assess an existing provider against all 103 standards. We're going to assess them in normal circumstances against a subset of those standards, which relate to corporate governance, academic governance, and internal quality assurance. But we reserve the right to extend the scope of the renewal of registration assessment where that's necessary, where that's indicated by a track record of issues arising or by our risk assessment framework, and the same applies for renewal of course accreditation. In addition, we will mount up in addition to the guidance material that I mentioned before, we will also most likely have a frequently asked questions document that covers individual issues that come up, individual questions that come up that are not covered by any of the broader guidance material. It doesn't justify a topic that doesn't justify having an entire guidance note just for that topic. Now, where do you find these materials, you might well ask? Well, if you go to the website, the TEQSA website, on the top, towards the top right-hand corner, you'll see a big box saying Standards Transition Project, New Higher Education Standards. So you can find these materials by entering through that route, or you can also open the menu Regulatory Approach towards the top left-hand corner, and the first item there is New Standards HESF 2015. That's another route through to find the guidance material and the application guides. And there's also another route using the For Providers menu option at the top of the screen. Now, to conclude, I'm just going to review some of the questions that have come up during the course of the roundtable about the new standards and our implementation of the new standards. One of the most frequent questions was, it takes time to get a number of changes through the system. What if it's not possible to complete all changes in order for us to be fully compliant with the new framework on 1st of January 2017? Well, from a legal standpoint, of course, you are required to be fully compliant, but we are not going to be going around knocking on the door on the 2nd of January, inspecting all aspects of your operations to make sure that everything is compliant. We do recognise that certain types of changes will need to go through an approval pathway. If there were major changes required to course documentation, that would take a certain amount of time to get through the pipeline to be implemented. But we would certainly want to see that there had been a systematic assessment of what is required, a plan of action, and that you are quite a considerable way down the path towards implementing that plan of action. Another common question was, there is now a set of research standards. Does this mean we're a non-university higher education provider? Does this mean we now have to undertake research? Answer, no, it doesn't mean that in itself. If you are not in a university category, if you're in a higher education category, that does not require a research program. Having said that, if you are delivering higher degrees by research, there is a requirement, as I said before, that these take place within an environment of research activity. So in any field in which you are delivering HDRs, as we said before, then you would be required to undertake research, and therefore that research would be covered by the research standards under 4.1. Another question that's kept on coming up is the question about the minimum volume of learning for AQF levels. I think we've covered that. I think the approach is yes, there will be some element of flexibility, but if that volume of learning is unduly low, appears to be unduly low, we will ask you to make out a case to us for why it is lower than we would expect, and we will ask you to justify it in relation to commonly available benchmarks such as the AQF guidelines, but also practice in respected systems and institutions around the world. Another one that's come up is, does TEQSA provide guidance about which external reviewers would be suitable for the corporate and academic governance review? Up to a point is the answer. Yes, if you look at our corporate governance guidance note available from the website, there is an appendix to that which talks about the scope of the corporate and academic governance review that we've talked about earlier, and also gives some criteria by which you might judge whether a reviewer had the skills and experience and qualifications necessary to undertake such a review. In some cases, you might need more than one reviewer. You might not be able to get one individual to undertake a large-scale review of both corporate governance and academic governance. Many experienced reviewers of corporate governance don't necessarily have experience of working in academic institutions and therefore may not be suitable for reviewing academic governance. But there are ways around this. It's not necessary for small institutions to be paying large amounts of money to consultants, multiple consultants, to undertake these reviews. And some of the reviewing can be undertaken by various forms of peer review, for example. But there's guidance about this available in the guidance note. How do we obtain further information? Well, if there are follow-up questions to this presentation, you can, of course, contact your case manager through email or telephone. If it's about interpretation of the standards, you could also send an email to standards@texsa.gov.au. And you can also subscribe to the latest news at the bottom of the TEQSA website. There's an RSS feed there, and which changes to the site will be notified through that RSS field. So that concludes the presentation. As I say, if you have any further questions, please send them in to us via any of those channels. And finally, good luck with the transition. Thank you.